Welcome, everyone, to This Explainer. I am honestly so thrilled you're joining us today because we are looking at a truly fascinating piece of source material. It's an autobiographical essay by a man named Randy Seaver from San Diego, California, and it's called My Place in History. What we're going to do today is use Randy's incredible 80-year journey as a sort of lens to explore a much larger, really universal question. How exactly do ordinary people fit into the grand sweeping narrative of history?
Okay, let's dive into this. When you actually sit down and ask yourself the question, where do you fit into history? What comes to mind? Well, Randy Seaver spent nearly 40 years meticulously researching his genealogy, tracking down soldiers and farmers and even kings. But eventually, he took that analytical lens and turned it right back on himself. He asked, am I just one more name sitting at the bottom of a very long pedigree chart, or do I actually brush up against history myself? And the honest, really compelling answer he found was, well, it's both. We are all products of an incredibly deep past, but we also stand right at the edge of genuinely historic moments in our own lifetimes.
Section 1. The Weight of Inheritance, From Kings to California.
Let's start by just wrapping our heads around the sheer vastness of time. Think about the staggering scale of his ancestral timeline for a second. If his research holds true, Randy's lineage stretches all the way back to the 800s with Charlemagne and Alfred the Great. Then, moving through William the Conqueror in 1066, jump forward a bit, and he descends from 13 completely ordinary English men and women who risked literally everything on a leaky ship called the Mayflower in 1620. Move forward again to the 1860s, and we find his great-great-grandfather, Isaac Seaver, who was a blacksmith serving in the Union Army. Now, none of these people, whether they were colonial governors or English monarchs, knew they were laying the tracks for a far-sighted kid born in San Diego in the 1940s. But they were.
That deep ancestral history brings us to a really beautiful phrase Randy uses to describe the life of his grandfather, Lyle Carringer, who was born in 1891. He calls it a lifetime of wonder. I mean, think about it. His grandfather lived to see the invention of the automobile, the airplane, 2 world wars, the rise of television, the atomic age, and actual men walking on the moon. He passed down this profound appetite for watching the world change, a real sense of awe that Randy carried into his own life as he witnessed the back half of the 20th century. Section 2. Witnessing the American Century, Front Row to the 1960s. Here, the narrative shifts from that deep ancestral history to the macro history that Randy witnessed firsthand as a young man. And this brilliantly illustrates 2 defining bookends of a deeply turbulent decade. In November 1963, Randy was just a 20-year-old student eating lunch in the San Diego State cafeteria when the intercom suddenly crackled with the tragic news of President Kennedy's assassination. He remembers this heavy feeling that the bright, hopeful decade he believed in had just cracked right down the middle. But contrast that with just 6 years later, in July 1969. He was sitting in his parents' living room, just watching Neil Armstrong step onto the moon. It was an incredible technological triumph that fulfilled a challenge JFK himself had laid down back in 1961. Millions of Americans watched these events, for sure, but Randy's point is that he was there. He was an active part of that collective memory. In fact, his proximity to history throughout the 60s was constant. He even had this fun little footnote in sports history, working as a training camp boy for the San Diego Chargers in 1963, which happens to be the exact year they won their only AFL championship. He lived through the intense anxiety of the Cuban Missile Crisis as a teenager. He witnessed the sorrow of 1968 with the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, and he watched the Watts riots in the Vietnam War unfold, the latter through a college deferment. And as a highly engaged citizen, he's voted in 16 presidential elections, going all the way from Johnson to Trump. Impartially speaking, these are massive historical touchpoints. Randy didn't just read about the American century in a textbook. He watched it unfold in real time, right from his living room couch. Section 3. Shaping the Modern World, the Science of Small Things. So, how exactly did Randy transition from just observing history to actively building it? Well, it all started with a really niche teenage hobby back in 1960 called DXing, basically hunting for distant AM radio stations bouncing off the ionosphere. Step 2, this quirky hobby turned him into an amateur scientist. He was studying how invisible radio waves propagate across a curved planet. He was even writing weekly club bulletins, which is essentially blogging by mimeograph decades before the internet was even a thing. Step 3, he took that exact same scientific patience and applied it to his career. Teasing physical truths out of radio waves was, it turns out, the perfect training ground for teasing physical truths out of stubborn things, like airflow over an aircraft wing.
The crucial point here is that this teenage hobby translated into a highly impactful 35-year career. Starting in 1967, Randy worked as an aerodynamicist at Rower Corporation in Chula Vista. He spent decades refining the engine pods, nacelles, and thrust reversers for the world's largest commercial jets. We're talking Boeing, Airbus, and McDonnell Douglas programs. Every single time you board a jetliner today and safely cross an ocean, you are quite literally living inside a piece of engineering history that people like Randy spent their whole careers refining, rivet by painstaking rivet.
He was so skilled at this that in 2004, after being happily retired for 2 years, he was called back. He came out of retirement specifically to help design the nacelle and thrust reverser for the Boeing 787 Dreamliner. Now, he wasn't a senator or an astronaut, sure, but by helping make modern flight safer, quieter, and more efficient, he undeniably left his fingerprints on the modern age.
Section 4. Becoming the Historian. Digitizing the Past.
After his engineering career wrapped up, Randy entered a really fascinating second act with Genea-Musings. Started on April 15, 2006, this is a daily blog where he has published essentially every single day since. Now, what's really interesting about this is how early internet genealogy in the mid-2000s was entirely its own form of history-making. Randy and his peers were among the very first generation of family historians to drag these vital records out of dusty courthouse basements and put them into a permanent, globally searchable digital format. Because of that blog, ordinary lives are forever preserved. A boy in 1686 Roxbury, a man making the long move from Pennsylvania to San Diego, Samuel Vaux crossing the ocean, a U.S. Marine. Randy meticulously documented these quiet, ordinary lives so that future generations wouldn't just find a birth date and a weathered headstone, they would find a real story. And by writing his own autobiographical essay, he's ensuring his future great-grandchildren will know exactly who came before them.
Section 5. The True Meaning of Legacy. The Ultimate Harvest.
We've talked a lot about English kings, the moon landing, and the Boeing 787. But what is Randy's most important legacy? While his roots might lie with those ancient monarchs, this is his actual, truest harvest. On Valentine's Day in 1970, he asked Linda to marry him. Linda was a 25-year teacher who shaped hundreds of children's minds without ever needing to make the headlines. Together, they raised 2 incredibly capable daughters, Lori and Tammy, who have gone on to build impressive careers and families of their own. And now, they have 5 grandchildren. To Randy, these people are the absolute most important legacy he will ever leave the world, historic or not.
Which brings us perfectly to the core thesis of our explainer today, captured so beautifully in this simple quote: "I am a hinge." Randy writes that history isn't only made by kings and astronauts. It's made by the 20-year-old kid sitting in the cafeteria, the aerodynamicist perfecting machines, the blogger who flat out refuses to let his family's story disappear. He sees himself as one small, ordinary link, a hinge, connecting the deep past of the Mayflower to the unfolding future of those 5 grandchildren.
And that brilliantly illustrates the real takeaway for all of us today. You don't actually have to be in the history books to be a vital part of history. You are a bridge between the generations that came before you and the ones that will follow. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this powerful, provocative thought to chew on. In the grand sweep of time, who are you a hinge for? Thank you so much for learning with me today. Keep asking great questions, and we'll see you next time.